Welcome, everyone. As Julie mentioned, the first 30 minutes of this will be the presentation, followed by Q&A. The Q&A has two components, and please feel free to post your questions through Q&A. If you have any difficulties with this, please talk to Julie or Sandhya or Elizabeth O'Brien, who are all monitoring this space. The second component is that panelists will have 4 questions that we will show you to get your thoughts flowing about collection developments and acquisitions. Questions will shortly be shown via slides. They will also be later shown on Mentimeter. While you're typing your answers in Mentimeter, I'll be moderating the questions that come through Q&A. If your question does not get asked due to time limitations, please feel free to contact one of the panel members later. Their contact information will be on the slides. Also, given the current situation where a couple of our librarian colleagues are coming from, please keep your questions focused only on collections and acquisitions and this particular project. Bios of all panel members were also sent via the registration email, so I will do a quick introduction. Moon, next slide. We have Moon Kim, Head of Collections from the University of British Columbia, Vancouver campus. Florence Mugabe, Librarian for African Studies, Africa Specialist, and Betsaida Reyes, Head of Humanities and Social Sciences from Penn State University. Next slide. Now we'll move on to showing you the questions that I mentioned. Start thinking about how your library aligned collections with EDI principles and share anything that you're able to. Next slide. We know things are changing fast, particularly in the U.S. with EDI. How do you think this will affect CARL libraries, specifically approaches to collections, partnerships, and decision-making? Next slide, please. Also think about what you can share about funding decisions and their alignment with your institutional values in the context of EDI. Next slide, please. And finally, getting back to the situations, how can CARL libraries and institutions sustain the infrastructure to support EDI in collection spaces? And as I said, don't worry, we will post these later on Mentimeter. I'm going to pass it off to Moon now.
Thank you all for this opportunity to talk about building distinctive collections today. So I'm actually going to kick us off by sharing the genesis of the project. So my background is being an acquisitions librarian, where I've seen firsthand how behind the scenes processes shape what ends up in our collections. So there was a time when selectors returning from buying trips abroad would come back with handwritten receipts, and the library finance or accounts payable departments might not honor them. These policies unintentionally limited whose voices and cultures were represented in our cultural heritage institutions. Also across institutions, both in the U.S. and Canada, acquisitions work, though very essential for collecting institutions, that work remains largely invisible. Staffing, comfort with different languages, etc., all influence what we're able to acquire. And yet, professionally, when we're talking about EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, as it relates to collections, the professional focus tends to be more on collection development or metadata and discovery, while acquisitions really sits at the critical intersection of those two areas. So I wanted to change some of that and bring visibility to the people and the infrastructures that hold power in shaping our collections. So in 2020, as part of the Association of Research Libraries Leadership and Career Development Program, I met Betsaida, Florence, and Angel. Angel's one of our other co-authors, who shared similar concerns. Together, we developed a research project exploring how acquisitions practices intersect with EDI goals and distinctive collections through a survey. So I won't go too much into the project since the link shared out included most of the information, but our objectives were to highlight and create awareness of the role acquisitions departments have and their oversight over the business, financial, and legal aspects of collection stewardship, what we're calling the acquisitions infrastructure. And I'm going to keep looking over here because that's where my main monitor is. We also wanted to interrogate the impact of acquisitions methodologies and infrastructures on supporting EDI, whether we're supporting it or preventing it, right, through the acquisitions infrastructure. And we also wanted to advance the conversation across cultural heritage institutions. So our survey was, the survey responses were collected from July 7th, 2021 to August 6th, 2021. So summer of 2021. And the focus areas of the survey were distinctive collections of ARL, Association of Research Libraries, and practices since 2009. So you see the definition of distinctive collections, and within the UBC context, we have three branches that I consider distinctive collections. So one, our rare books and special collections, which includes university archives. Two, Asian Library, and three, Huehua Library, which is our indigenous branch. We do have some other areas that are part of the humanities and social sciences library that might include like Eastern European collections that would also very much fall into this landscape as well. A quick note about the ARLs. So for the purposes of this webinar, the Canadian members of ARLs are all members of CARL, but not all CARL libraries are members of ARL. And you might be wondering why practices since 2009. And that's really because that's when the term distinctive collections really began to be codified. And we're going to talk about acquisitions quite a bit. But for the purposes of our project, collection development is selection, and selection is the process of deciding which materials should be added to a library's collection. Acquisitions is the purchase of resources where there is a financial transaction. So this could include collection building methods such as donations and loans, where the institution might pay for shipping, just as an example, which would result in a financial transaction. Acquisitions is also the library unit that facilitates the negotiations, licensing, ordering, receipt, and or payment for purchased resources. So we're going to look at some examples of the survey responses. And while most of the responses were from the US, we did have 7 responses from Canada in our survey. And we're going to look at the acquisitions infrastructure next. So you might recall, it's really the business, financial, and the legal infrastructure and those aspects of collection stewardship. So for example, it would include fiscal decision-making, vendor setup, budget allocations, etc. So these were the type of questions that were asked in the survey. What type of acquisition methods are you using? What type of firm order method are you using? How strict is it to purchase new resources? Who makes decisions on the collection's budget allocations? Who has signing authority? And all of this culminated in our article, Building Distinctive Collections. We also brought in another author, Paulo, who provided a fresh take to help us finish the analysis and writing component. So thank you, Paulo. So here are the takeaways. And some of this we kind of suspected and we largely thought we knew, but the project also helped confirm some of what we thought and what we learned. So larger budgets do not equal more diverse collections. And diversity is not a given just because the collections are from abroad, especially if it reflects only the colonial, mainstream, and dominant cultural perspectives. It seems like within the ARLs, there are current initiatives through individual and institutional efforts like guidelines for collection development policies, some collaboration across different units or institutions, and overall, there seemed to be a willingness and readiness within the ARL community to expand their EDI work. But it seems like there is still more infrastructure and policies that need to be fleshed out to fully support all of the aspirations that were expressed in the survey. And for some of this to be enacted so that, not EDI isn't just, like the job of select individuals or the EDI committee, but also the responsibility of everyone. Although the project largely covered, certain aspects of the acquisitions infrastructure, our survey welcomed multiple perspectives from a single institution. So one of the most fascinating parts for me of the survey was seeing the intersection of the responses from a single institution and how different individuals interpreted the infrastructure very differently. And this is actually the next part of the research project that Maha and I will likely work on in the future, and I'll show a preview. So we received a total of 77 responses, but we had some individuals from the same institution fill it out. So in the end, we have 45 institutions represented, and there were instances where, like, with one institution, we got 5 responses. At 3 institutions, we got 4 responses, and so on. So if we go back to that earlier question of how strict is it to purchase new resources, and look at the responses by the institutions, especially if we look at institution C, they were both selectors who filled out the data. One person thought it was very strict. Another person thought it wasn't strict at all. So I think that was maybe the most extreme example. But if we look at the question of who makes decisions on the collections budget allocations, at a single institution, we got responses from 3 selectors, 1 from acquisitions and 1 from admin. And there is clearly a consensus that libraries administration is involved in the collections budget. But I guess from my perspective, I would have thought something like who makes decisions on it would be pretty clear cut. But it's interesting to see these discrepancies and how people interpret this work to be happening. So that's kind of where I'll wrap up with the project, except I also wanted to take this opportunity to highlight some responses from the Canadian ARL members who filled out our survey. So thank you. And remember, the survey responses were collected in the summer of 2021. So at that point in time, these were the thematic suggestions that came out of the responses from the Canadian ARLs. So, back EDI policies with actual resources and not just statements. Diversify the acquisitions channels. So, for example, buy from less established vendors, go directly to community sources and creators to really diversify our collections. And that within reason is actually my qualifier, and I'll get back to that a bit later. Some of the other suggestions were to collaborate across expertise and build a more inclusive digital infrastructure that would enable equitable discovery, multilingual access, and representation. So now we're going to share some of the institutional examples. So next, Betsaida, Florence, and I will talk about some of the current initiatives, infrastructure, and challenges at our respective institutions.
Thank you, Moon. So if you go to the next slide, after working on this project, the thing that was really salient for me was what can we control and where we can make some changes. So as the head of a department, I have some control over how the budget for collections is allocated. Again, only at specific levels. So this only impacts a specific unit, in this case, the Arts and Humanities Library unit. We don't have an approval plan at Penn State. But when I started to get into the nitty-gritty of the budget, I realized that while we have been very fortunate to have a lot of support, particularly from endowments, a lot of that support was really concentrated in areas like Jewish studies. We cannot make changes to that. We're grateful for it, But then why do we have to have the same person who's managing Jewish studies also get state funds that's more flexible and could be reallocated? So as I started to get into it, I realized that there was a lot that I could do to balance out those budgets and maybe reduce how much funding one subject area got and increase it in another area. In that case, what resulted was a decrease in state funding for areas like Jewish studies and an increase of state funding in those more open-ended endowments towards other international area studies. History over the time had been severely underfunded, and I was able to bring funding levels back up. Additionally, because my background is a subject librarian, I understand how important book fairs are to collection development. I started to talk to librarians about, hey, have you visited a book fair? Is this something you are interested in doing? And it's been really amazing to see just the shift and how much more they're engaging in that way to make sure that we are collecting from the small publishers. Because sure, you could go to a book fair like Frankfurt and get, as Moon mentioned, some of the more traditional publishers. But if you step out of that and visit local bookstores, particularly we've been interested in developing comics and graphic novels for German studies. It's given the librarian responsible for that area an opportunity to really get more of those hard to get publications than they would have otherwise. So it's been interesting to utilize the lessons from the research project to enact changes at a more local level, even if that's a reduced level of scope. With that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Florence.
Thank you so much, Betsinda. I'm going to talk with my video off, and next slide, please. I'm going to put forth the disclaimer that all the views represented in as I talk are my own and not of the Library of Congress. And like Betsinda said, I think when we started this project, I was actually in another institution. I think the three of us were in different institutions and kind of moved on to where we are at now. And I wanted to focus a little bit on what's next if you are in an institution that has some of these, some of the infrastructure that we are trying to get to. If they already have those infrastructure in place, what else can we do? Does that mean that we are going to go and that we are going to have inclusive, diverse collections? And one of the things, some of the things I've realized through this work of building inclusive collections is that even with organizational structures in place, there is so much that depends on selectors, subject specialists, liaisons, and recommending officers that we are, as the staff that are involved and as libraries, we have to do so much more. So especially like the Library of Congress, there's a lot of collections, overviews, collection development policies that are very well written. We have area standards, each of them kind of like having their way of the statements that spell out what they can do, and even going further to categorizing countries and regions, depending on the challenges that the acquisition department has actually experienced when trying to acquire materials. And then there is recommending officers and overseas offices. So the overseas offices have been created to actually take care of some of these regions where acquiring materials has been difficult. But we come back again to the specialists and recommending officers, and we realize that everything really depends on what policies, what statements in terms of acquisition statements that the recommending officers and the specialists are able to write out. So I've also realized that it is important that we and libraries invest in developing clear and specific collections policy statements, as well as investing in continued regular reviews and updates. Because if you are operating with an undated policy statement, it's really not going to help, even though the structures are already there. And the statements should spell out very clearly collecting scopes, and they should be such that they support building inclusive and representative collections. Make these statements kind of tangible. When you say you want to buy from local people or small businesses, or whatever that case might be, it's important to go a step further to actually define what that looks like, so that if someone else other than you is using that policy, they are actually able to implement it. One other thing that I've seen that is worth really paying attention to is reviewing practices and procedures that are already in place in order to align them with evolving landscapes. And this could be in terms of collections, it could be in budgets, information as it's changing, strategic and directions from different institutions, and even formats. Also reviewing like serious continuing resources that tie up substantial amounts of money, but may fly under the radar. And you might realize how much you can free up from your budgets to be able to take care of other things that you won't want to use in your in collecting widely. What the overseas offices at the Library of Congress are really designed to take care of these regions where acquiring is a challenge. And one good thing about that is the staff is local, so they understand the markets. They are able to actually go and buy in cash, like purchase and acquire and go around stores. And this is also something that is offered to other research libraries within the US. I'm not sure that it extends to Canada, but that is actually not enough. From my position, I have realized having people on the ground and people being able to go around the communities, trying to figure out what is out there and actually purchasing is really not enough. There has to be somebody who is kind of like putting a scope. There has to be somebody who is paying attention and seeing what it is that they really want to collect and how that looks like. Another thing that we've that is something of focus to take care of diverse collecting and incorporate that is web archiving, because we also realize in some of these regions there's a lot of things being created on the web, and they are really very transitory. They may exist today, they are not in existence tomorrow. We have government websites that are not stable, but we want to collect that. How do we do that and make sure that we have a record of something that appears today and is very important, but not tomorrow? So there is a focus on really on doing web archiving, which also comes back to selectors and recommending officers in terms of being able to identify that and put it in a policy or a statement to actually give us that focus. So I just wanted to highlight some of those things. Even with infrastructure, it still comes back to us as a specialist to be able to pay attention to what is going on in our areas. And I'm going to pass it back on to Moon.
Thank you, Florence and Betsaida. Okay, so maybe I've been in academia for too long, but I think of work as like my lab or a studio where I want to like throw paint and experiment and test how things work. So for me, there has to be a really practical component to all of this. And I think both Besaida and Florence alluded to that as well, where we want to be able to apply what we learn and activate it at work. UBC's current strategic directions include the following: priorities and plans. UBC also has an Indigenous procurement strategy to prioritize the purchase of goods and services from Indigenous businesses, which are defined as majority owned, controlled, 51% or more by Indigenous peoples. This strategy is supported by a centralized Indigenous business directory, which helps UBC employees connect with Indigenous-owned businesses. So for now in the library, my understanding is that the Indigenous procurement strategy is really in the works more around furniture, equipment, and office supplies, but there are Indigenous bookstores also in that directory. The library's Indigenous Strategic Plan guides much of our work. It outlines concrete goals like prioritizing Indigenous vendors and ensuring timely and equitable compensation for Indigenous partners. But to reach these goals, we also have to look closely at what's already happening in our local context and how our day-to-day systems and workflows either support or slow down this kind of change. Progress doesn't always come from grand gestures, and sometimes it's really about rethinking the small practical things that make a big difference. So when I arrived at UBC in 2023, as someone that has oversight over the fiscal operations and workflows, one of the things I did was I started meeting regularly with colleagues both at Huehua and the Asian Library to learn about their specific challenges and priorities. So Huehua Library is one of the only Indigenous academic library branches in Canada. Because of its unique history and autonomy, its workflows evolved over the years very organically. And when I started, there had been enough attrition that it was a good time to pause and reset a baseline. So what do I mean by a baseline? So for example, we connected Huehua colleagues to our collections listserv in the library and made sure they received the vendor training through Gobi. Gobi, which is one of our core acquisitions platforms for purchasing certain types of materials. We discussed different vending options and prioritizations. However, the way we're staffed at UBC on the technical services side, we're not in a position to make sweeping changes overnight. So we're needing to make more incremental changes. And this is going back to what I was saying earlier about buying from less established vendors, creators, etc., within reason earlier. So I do want to continue utilizing automated services of vendors like Gobi for mainstream materials because large vendors like them, their systems are interoperable with ours. Our systems can talk to their systems so we can batch order things, we can bulk download invoices so we don't have to manually create them one by one. So we work with vendors like this so that we can create capacity to work on the one-off titles that we might need to do for special collections or Huehua. So the work now is really about incremental and sustainable change, building capacity within existing systems, reviewing unique situations as they come up, and making sure our procedures support rather than, block these collecting areas. So once we had those foundations in place, we could start identifying where the infrastructure wasn't serving those areas. So things like limited payment options or workflows that made it really difficult to acquire from smaller community-based sources. Or we even talked about looking at the market and possibly working with dealers. And there are some ethical considerations we also need to take into account if we go down this path. The cultural heritage collections market might have gotten more predatory with the rise of EDI and the shift in collecting trends. And I'm not really sure if this is a matter of whether certain types of materials branded as EDI were historically underpriced and now this is a market correction. So the prices have gone way up or not. And we've talked about, do we even want to be a part of this market? Or should we, since we have the institutional resources that will help preserve the content and make accessible the ones that are not embargoed for future research and consultation? We're still trying to figure that out and we're still having those conversations. So both WEPA and the Asian Library have expressed to me the importance of the reimbursement policy and workflows that support that. So while reimbursement and debt culture is not ideal, there are instances where that's really the only way to acquire certain types of content from, at community events with cash. And I know Betsaida kind of alluded to that too, like attending book fairs, etc. And sometimes it's as simple as reviewing historical decisions and updating workflows, which Florence also mentioned. So over at the Asian Library, the challenges are a bit different, but equally systemic. So acquiring materials across borders introduces extra time and risk, whether it's shipping delays through canals there's a drought or there's piracy or something going on, or postal disruptions like Canada Post, or if we need to build in more time to do translation of the licenses and contracts. One of the things we did was build some dashboards to help us know how long orders are taking to be fulfilled by the vendors. And this one Tableau dashboard built by one of my amazing colleagues, Megan Waite, at UBC Library, kind of helps us with the data component. So we're trying to figure out where the data is or doesn't exist. And we want to track fulfillment timelines and make small adjustments based on what we're seeing in the data. So setting earlier selection deadlines for certain areas where we anticipate things are going to take longer, so that the orders can be processed and received within the same fiscal year. It may sound procedural, but these small shifts protect budgets and create flexibility that we need to do more meaningful and longer planning for distinctive collections. So bringing all this together, what we're really after is building responsive workflows that modernize operations, making incremental and sustainable changes, capturing the data and where it's possible and where those data stories are missing, figuring that out and how we might need to advocate for them differently. Rethinking acquisitions really as a site of equity and inclusion and activating the acquisitions infrastructure to continue supporting certain these areas with these larger strategic plans in mind. And this work really requires not just the commitments and partnerships between selectors and acquisitions, but also administrators and the campus, as well as the professional community, like why we're all here today. And now I'm gonna pass it over to Maha for the next part.
Thank you, Betsaida, Florence, and Moon, for sharing all your work, your experiences with this, findings, suggestions, and the final summary in the last slide. Just a quick recap. There are differences between institutions in how collections and acquisitions are done. It is important to network and collaborate to learn and unlearn from each other. EDI is often, if not always, on the fringes. Within collections, EDI may focus on metadata, discovery, or certain topics or certain subject areas. But what I'm hearing is through critical reflection, librarians involved in this work can center it within collections and acquisitions. We work in Eurocentric infrastructures and systems. They're not going to change overnight, but if you consider this work as a lab, be experimental, you can make incremental changes. We still need to work with the existing systems and vendors, but small changes are possible. I also heard that between the lack of metadata and description to discover materials, the rigid systems, the funding limitations, not enough EDI materials being published or suddenly overpublished and then overpriced, particularly at this moment, this whole process could become a vicious cycle. But librarians can get out of this cycle if there is a strategic approach and an acquisition framework that fully embeds EDI.